All right, so today we're going to start chapter 9 about capital budgeting and cash flow analysis. So last class I just gave you the concept of capital, what we mean by capital. Okay? And basically we're talking about investment made by companies. Okay? So capital is something you can say means of production or tools that can generate cash flow for more than a year. Okay? So it's quite related to the concept of investment. Okay? Investment in economics, when we say investment, we're talking about some expenditure on highways, bridges, or plants, and so on. Something that lasts more than a year. Okay? So once you produce these things, you can use year after year. Okay? So as far as corporations are concerned, we're talking about similar concept. Once you spend money in the plant, building plants, purchasing equipment, tools, okay, you can probably use them more than a year, longer than a year, okay? And you can generate cash flows from these tools, right, for many years. Okay? So in this chapter, we're going to talk about some introductory stuff. Okay? How do we decide which project, which capital investment we're going to choose? Okay? So in order to do that, we have to figure out, first of all, what are the choices? Are there any alternatives in this capital investment? Okay? And then in order to choose one of the many alternatives, we have to assess the profitability, right? Which one is the most profitable? Right? So for that purpose, how to calculate the expected cash flow and expected cost, and so on. Okay? So those will be the topics in this chapter. Okay? So here are a few definitions. Capital budgeting is the process of planning for purchases of assets whose returns are expected to continue beyond a year. Okay? Okay. And capital expenditure, of course, is spending money or cash outlay that is expected to generate a flow of future cash benefits, in other words, future cash flows, okay, lasting longer than 1 year. Okay? And cost of capital, we're talking about how much it costs to purchase this capital, right? But typically, we are not talking about dollar amount, okay? But we are talking about, when we say cost of capital, we're talking about rate, okay? You can say interest rate, similar to interest rate, okay? So it's a very typical concept of cost of capital is investors' required rate of return. How can we say that? I mean, when we say cost of capital, what we mean by investors' required rate of capital or return? Where do companies get money? Suppose your company decides to invest in certain project. Let's say you want to build another plant, okay? Or purchase another company on another plant. Okay? Where do you come up with money? Well, of course, there can be a few choices, right? A few different methods of raising capital, raising money. Okay? But which is the most common or usual way of raising money for company? Selling products? Yeah. Okay, well, of course, yes, you can sell the products and generate the revenue, okay? And maybe you can accumulate the, I guess, saving in your saving, right? Suppose this is a new project, and suddenly this opportunity came around, so you did not. I guess what you're suggesting is the most ideal way. In other words, you're talking about using the cash that you already have accumulated, right? But what that also means is you have not used this cash so far, right? So you've been sitting on this cash cushion, okay? And we're talking about opportunity cost missed. In other words, the whole idea of running a business is you use your money to generate larger profit, right? And if you have not been doing that, if you have been just saving and accumulating cash flow, right, then apparently you've been missing the opportunity to generate the future profit, right? So I guess in ideal situation, the companies, of course, they have to have some cash just in case, right? Something happens, right? For some unexpected outlay, or who knows? Economy may go down suddenly. Something happens, right? Right now it's crazy because of China's slowdown in economic growth. Yeah? Last about 10 days, Dow Jones went down, about 11%, which means my retirement fund, it's just completely my, maybe a year and a half worth of increase in my growth in my retirement has been completely wiped out within a week, right? So, that can happen, and that happens many times, frequently, right? So, companies keep certain amount of cash, but usually when they find out a new opportunity and then they try to make a new investment, right? They usually don't have enough money to finance entire investment project, right? So assuming that, how do you come up with money? Borrow, right? How do you borrow? Yes, sell the bonds, right? Sell the bonds is most typical way for companies to raise cash, raise enough money to finance a project. Yeah. So the question is, when you sell the bonds, right? You are trying to sell the bonds to investors, right? And what rate of return do these investors require? In other words, what interest rate should you offer on your bonds? Right? That's what we mean by cost of capital, right? So when you raise the cash to finance a project, right, can you offer, say, 7% annual rate? Which means once you borrow this money, you're going to be paying 7% interest on the money every year. Well, it may not be enough, right? Investors may think that's just too low, right? I want a little higher rate of return on my money, right? So, what is the rate of return that the investors require, right? That's what we're talking about. Investors require rate of return, right? So that becomes the cost of capital. Well, cost of capital is a topic that we're going to talk about in detail, I believe, in chapter 12. Okay? Just to give you some ideas, it can be determined by many different factors. First of all, what's the market interest rate currently, right? Well, right now the market interest rate is extremely low, right? The country like the United States, the market interest rate is almost zero, right? Because of the financial troubles that they had. Well, actually, the entire world had, about 7-8 years ago, 2007, 2008, financial trouble. Okay? So in order to sustain or support the economy, Federal Reserve has been keeping the interest rate extremely low, right? And as a result, the interest rate all over the world are currently extremely low, right? So I guess at this time, you don't have to offer really high interest rate on your bonds, okay? Because it all depends on the opportunity cost. Okay? If you don't buy this bond, where are you going to invest your money? Well, because of overall interest rate pretty low, right? They don't have a lot of other opportunities, other use of their money, right? All right, so that's the idea of cost of capital. So market interest rate matters. Specifically, when you offer the bonds, they will look at the risk of your company, right? Because after all, you are promising IOU, right? IOU or IOU, okay? So you're promising to pay the money back after a certain number of years, right? But if the company has already accumulated a lot of debt, right, then that increases the risk for default, right? Because when you have a lot of debt, your annual debt payment grows. Okay? The question is, are you generating enough revenue to cover the debt servicing cost? Okay? So they will look at your debt asset ratio, debt equity ratio, and all kinds of things to evaluate the debt servicing ability of the company, right? So if the company has already amassed a lot of debt, then they'll probably require higher rate of return to compensate for the risk they're taking, right? So that's the idea of cost of capital. All right. How projects are classified? Well, I'm basically following the order of the chapter, how our textbook presents these concepts, right? You will find out these slides are pretty easy to follow. And again, make sure you read the chapters in advance before you come to class. Okay? Then it'll be piece of cake. Okay? All right, so there are three different types of projects mentioned by our chapter: independent projects, mutually exclusive projects, and contingent projects. Okay? Independent projects means, well, you don't have to worry about any other thing. This project, you can just go ahead and start, right? There are no other constraints, okay? And you can just, as long as you have sufficient fund, okay, you can go ahead and start. You don't have to worry about other things, okay? But mutually exclusive projects means you have a few alternatives, okay? Say ABC, projects A and B and C, right? And if you choose to take on the project A, then that eliminates either B or C or both, right? So you cannot undertake B or C if you choose A, right? If you choose to have B, spend money on B, then you have to give up other alternatives, right? That's the mutually exclusive projects. Okay? Contingent projects means if you decide to go ahead with the project A, there has to be another project, related project. Okay? So you have to consider not only the cost of A, but cost of B as well. So you have to consider the total cost of two projects, right? What are the examples? Well, the mutually exclusive projects, I guess the easiest example is, suppose you are trying to build another plant. Your business is doing well, right? Your sales is growing, right? So you need a larger production capacity, right? The textbook gives the example of BMW plant in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Okay? That's about half-hour away from my school, okay? Southern Wesleyan University, okay? In South Carolina. Okay? So I take my students actually to BMW Spartanburg plant about once a year for a tour. It's a wonderful facility, and they produce all the SUVs, sports utility vehicles, that they sell in the, well, not just in Taiwan. I mean, what I heard at that time, about 3 years ago, is that's the only SUV plant, BMW SUV plant, outside Germany. Okay? So they have SUV plant in Germany, but whatever is sold in all over the world outside Germany, well, I guess, but you know, so it's a huge operation. Yeah? Very high-tech, cutting-edge facility. Yeah? But apparently, when I think they built that plant about 10 years ago, yeah, maybe 7 years ago, right? And they had a few choices, a few competing locations. Apparently, North Carolina also offered some locations, right? I mean, when the companies like BMW expresses their interest in building a plant, then there's a state government, they will do whatever they can to bring this plant to their state, right? Gives a lot of tax advantage, okay? And a lot of the exceptions on the regulation, all kinds of things. Okay? But finally, I guess they chose South Carolina, Spartanburg, South Carolina, as their location. Okay? So what that means is they had these alternatives, right? South Carolina, North Carolina, or some other location, maybe Tennessee, right? The Volkswagen has their plant in Tennessee. Right? So yeah, if you choose one, then other you have to give up, right? That's the idea of mutually exclusive projects. Yeah? Contingent project, something like installing some filtering equipment. Let's say you are trying to build a new plant, right? But if you want to build a new plant, then because of the environmental regulation, right, you have to also do some other project, like installing the filtering equipment before you release water into the river, right? You have to clean up the water, right? Or maybe you have to do some what is it, civil engineering project to change the location of the river or whatever. You have to, if there's a river flowing, right, then you have to do some civil engineering to divert the water, right, into your plant location, right? So building a plant is project A, but then there are some contingent projects, right, required, right, to make the project A possible, right? So you can say that's a contingent project, right? So in your note, you have these many different types of projects: expansion, replacement, refunding, and so on, right? Can you think of what type of project these are? Let's say expansion. Expansion means you want to build another plant. You want to increase your productive capacity, right? Can it be independent or mutually exclusive or contingent? What? Independent? Yeah, it could be independent, right? But it could also be the mutually exclusive project, just like the BMW example, right? If you had a few alternatives, right, then that becomes a mutually exclusive project, right? But if for some reason you had, let's say you have your plant, and right next to your plant there is open land, right? So you have no reason to consider any other location. I mean, this location is perfect, right? You just need larger capacity, right? Then that could be an independent project, right? You don't need to consider any alternatives, right? All right. Replacement. Suppose you have some equipment, right? And you're trying to replace the equipment. What type of project can it be? Contingent? Why? Okay, increase the capacity. What? Contingent means in order to undertake the one project, you have to have another project occurring at the same time, right? Replacement project, many times you can say it's a mutually exclusive project because you have a few choices. The question is, are you going to replace it with another new equipment, right? Or are you going to replace it with used equipment? Okay? Or instead of purchasing, are you going to lease the equipment? Something like that, right? So you have to debate the benefit and cost of these different choices, right? So it could be, it could be independent project, right? But in case you are considering a few different choices, it could be a replacement project, right? Refunding. What are we talking about here? Refund. Any idea what refunding is? Wenji? Never heard of refunding? Yeah. Well, of course, refunding is when you buy something and you want to return it and get your money back. I guess that's refunding, right? But in corporation setting, what are we talking about? Refunding. How can it be a project? Refunding.
Not sure, but I can guess it could be collect money from others and invest those capitals to other companies
Close, right? Yeah.
I guess too, but maybe it's to recapitalize the company.
Okay. Yeah, I guess you're close too, right? We are talking about bond refunding, bond refunding, or core feature. What is a core feature on bond? When the company issues bonds, right? They can issue the bond with a core feature, right? You understand what core means, right? So when you issue the, say, 20-year bond, which means you promise to pay it back in 20 years, right? But then it says, well, after 10 years, between 10th year and 11th year, we can call this bond. We have an option of calling, right? In other words, you say, okay, why don't you bring your bond back? We're going to pay your money back, right? That's called bond calling or bond refunding, right? Why would you do that? What's the typical reason for calling the bond? That's right, right? So you can think about your personal finance, right? It's called the refinancing, right? When you buy a house, right? Depending on the situation, you could pay, say, 10% annual interest rate on the money you borrow to buy a house, right? But let's say after 5 years, market interest rate went down to 3%, right? So you can borrow the money at 3%, right? Then a lot of people would refinance. What that means is they borrow money at 3% and use that money to pay back the 10% loan, right? So that's going to reduce your annual interest payment, right? So the idea of bond refunding is, when you issue the bond at high interest rate, right? Later, if you can borrow at low interest rate, you can call the bond. You can issue the new bond at much lower interest rate, right? And use that money to pay back the old bond, right? That's called the bond refunding, right? Well, that requires money, right? Because you have to pay back this the money you borrowed already, right? So it can be considered a project, right? And that can also have some alternatives, right? Are you going to issue the new bond to raise capital to pay back the old bond? Or are you going to simply borrow money from the bank, right? Or what? But what else can they do to raise money? Yes? That's right. Equity financing, right? The corporations have basically two ways to raise money, right? Debt financing versus equity financing, right? So debt financing means selling bond to raise money, right? Equity financing means selling stocks, selling shares, right? To raise money, right? So, you have to debate the pros and cons, benefit and cost of all these choices, right? And you have to decide. Leasing, merger and acquisition. Merger and acquisition. The companies constantly look for acquisition target, right? Because in fact, right, that's the most frequently observed way to grow, right? When you own a business, you constantly think about making your business grow, right? And I told you about, so far we talked about the building another plant and so on. But before you build another plant, you will look for acquisition target. Is there any other plant, any other company which is on the market, right? Because it's a lot cheaper, right? It has a lot of advantage of acquiring company instead of creating a new company or building a new plant, right? Because when you try to build a new plant or create a new company, there's a lot of risk because it's something new, right? New location, and you don't know how it's going to work out, right? But when you're trying to buy or purchase existing company or existing plant, and it's already there, and you have all the information, right? What's the operational cost, right? And another advantage is these existing companies have their customers, right? So when you purchase the new business, that new business comes with existing customers, right? So that's what business owners do always, constantly, every day. They look at this business newspaper and information source, right? And see if there is any acquisition target, right? So, M&A could be mostly, I guess, mutually exclusive project because you have alternatives. Well, it may not have to be mutually exclusive if you have sufficient money, right? I guess you can purchase more than one at the same time, right? Education and training. That's an interesting case, right? Education and training, right? What kind of project can it be? Yeah.
Educating staff to work with new equipment.
New equipment. Okay. So what kind of project is that? No, I'm talking about between among the independent, mutually exclusive, and contingent project, right? What do you think? So your example is you purchased a new equipment, right? And in order for your employees to operate this new equipment, you need to provide education and training, right? So what kind of project is this? Huh? Yeah? Independent? No? Okay. Here's a new project. You purchased the new equipment. But in order to have this new equipment, you also have to provide training so that people can actually operate this new equipment, right? So what are we talking about? Contingent project, right? Contingent project. In order to have A, you also have to have B. So the cost of the project, you have to consider both projects at the same time, right? So without that training, you may not be able to operate the new equipment, right? And so on. How about ad campaign, advertisement campaign? Could be, I guess, if you are spending money on advertisement just to increase the current sales, right, and current product, right? That could be independent, right? But suppose you develop a new product, right? So you're trying to develop a new product. You spend some money and started a new business or new line of business, right? So next month you're going to introduce a completely new product, right? The trouble is what? Consumers have no idea what that is, right? And they never heard of this product, right? So what do you have to do? You have to spend some money and advertise, right? This new product, right? So what are we talking about? What kind of product, what kind of project is this? Huh? Could be another contingent, right? Because you have a new project introducing new product, right? But in order to do that, you have to also spend money on advertisement, right? We're talking about that kind of things for contingent project. All right? Any question? Availability of funds. Well, capital rationing means a situation. It refers to the situation where a company does not have sufficient fund to undertake all the projects that they desire, right? So they may have some list of projects A, B, C, D, right? But in order to start on all 4 projects, you need, say, $100 million, okay? But right now, the best you can do is $70 million, okay? You know, considering all the sources of fund, including bonds and whatever, right? Your financial manager says, well, right now, 70 million is the best we can do, okay? Then, obviously, you have to, give up some of the projects, right? So that's the idea of capital rationing, right? Just giving the fund. I guess what you have to do is you have to rank the projects in terms of profitability, right? And then choose maybe first 2 or first 3, right? That you can undertake with the money you have, right? Okay, so here's a little bit details of doing that, right? The idea of capital. And capital rationing is probably the situation or reality for most of the companies. I mean, nobody has unlimited amount of fund, right? Even the big companies like GE or, whatever, Bank of America, right? Doesn't mean that they can spend money unlimited amount or freely on anything they like, right? They all have the some limited fund, okay? So how do we come up with the best way to spend money, right? We have to consider the marginal cost of capital and investment opportunity curve, okay? And here's the illustration, right? This is directly out of the textbook, right? Well, first of all, IOC, investment opportunity cost curve, is this downward sloping curve, right? And that's just a collection of different projects. So we have projects starting from A to I, right? And they are ordered in terms of the profitability or expected rate of return, right? So, and on the bottom here, on the horizontal axis, it shows the amount of money that's required, right? Amount of money that each project requires. So for example, the project A requires $2 million, right? And it has expected return of 24%. The next project, next best project is B, right? It has expected return of what? About 22%, right? But it requires $1 million, right? So this is how we construct this IOC, investment opportunity curve. Okay? So it's downward sloping because you have ordered it or ranked it that way, right? Then we have this upward sloping curve. It's called the marginal cost of capital. Marginal cost of capital, right? So marginal cost of capital shows the cost of capital for the amount of money you can raise, right? So what that means is, in this case, the first segment here, it goes like about $2.75 million, right? So apparently this company can raise about $2.75 million at about 9%, right? And then if they need more money, if they want to raise more money, right? The next segment is about what? 6.4 minus 2.7, right? How much is that? 6.4 minus 2.7, 3.7, right? Yeah. So the story is this company can raise next $3.7 million at maybe about 10%, right? Slightly higher rate, right? And so on. Okay? So that's the idea of marginal cost of capital. Okay? Marginal cost of capital is upward sloping, okay? Because, obvious reason is, of course, company would, when they need money, they would come to the best source of the money, best source of the fund, right? So if they can issue bond at, say, 9%, right? And that's the best they can do, then they would use that method first to raise the capital, right? And after that, if they need more money, right? Unfortunately, let's say right now, for whatever the reason, right? They can sell the bond only up to $2.75 million, right? After that, nobody's going to buy this company's bond, right? And then what's the next source? I don't know, maybe go to the bank and negotiate some loans with the bank, right? And say bank requires about 10%, right? So that's the story, right? So because a company would use the cheapest source of money first, right? as the amount of money, amount of fund increases, you're going to have higher and higher rate of return, cost of capital. Okay. Another reason you can think of is when the company borrows more and more, as I mentioned before, right? The company will be considered riskier by the investment, right? So the investors will require higher rate of return on their investment, right? So if you keep, if you're trying to sell more and more bond, right, then you will have to offer higher and higher interest rate to investors, right? That's the idea. All right. Then here it says the total return is maximized where the MCC and the IOC cross, right? So on this graph right here, when the IOC and MCC cross each other, right here, right? That's the point where the total return is maximized. In other words, that's the optimal amount of investment, right, that this company should undertake, right? Because the company obviously tries to maximize the return, right? Maximize the profit. Right? Why? How can we explain that, right? So let me try to make you understand that way, right? And let me try to refresh your memory in principles of economics. Okay? Profit maximization. You remember the condition, profit maximizing condition? I know it's been a while, right? Like a year, right? What's the profit maximizing condition? Yeah? Uh-huh. Yeah, marginal cost equals what? Marginal revenue. Yeah. Okay. Well, okay, but why? Okay, so we have, all right. Yeah. Okay. This is the total revenue curve, which is P times Q, right? Let's say price is $5. You produce something and selling at $5 per unit, right? And if you sell 100 units, right, then your total revenue is 5 times 100, okay? So if you have 100, 200, 300, right, your total revenue grows at the straight linear fashion, right? So if price happens to be 5, then this is 500, this is what, 1,000, and this is 1,500, okay? You understand the total revenue curve, right? It's just a straight line, okay? Apparently this slope is 5, okay? Because every time you sell additional unit, right? One more unit, your revenue grows by 5. Okay, it's a very simple idea. Okay? And then, what's the profit? Profit is total revenue minus what? Total cost, right? The difference is the profit. Okay? So if you want to find out the profit maximizing point, you have to bring in the total cost curve, right? Total cost curve typically looks like this. Okay? So when I guess when you start from 0, you can say the total cost is 0, right? well, whether you have, it depends on whether you have fixed cost or variable, fixed cost or not, right? But typically, there is a breaking even point here, right? So when you have very low output, total cost exceeds the total revenue, which means your profit is negative, right? But as you produce more and more, your profit grows, okay? And apparently, the maximum profit is achieved somewhere here, right? So that's the profit maximizing quantity, right? Because we're talking about the difference between the total revenue and total cost, right? That's the profit, right? Okay. All right. So when do we have this maximum profit? Okay. We can think about at the marginal level, right? Think about the marginal revenue and the marginal cost. Okay. Marginal revenue is horizontal. What is the marginal revenue in our example? 5. Okay. Because marginal revenue is change in total revenue over change in Q, right? So every time you sell one more unit, your total revenue increases by $5, right? So marginal revenue is constant at 5, right? And marginal cost, of course, is change in total cost over change in output, right? So we're talking about the slope of this total cost curve, right? And apparently it is a little steep in the beginning, but it becomes flatter and flatter, and then it becomes steep again, right? The slope of the total cost curve, right? So that's why we have marginal cost curve like this. It's a little high, but then becomes minimum here, achieves minimum here, and then it grows, okay? And where is the profit maximizing point, right? Well, think about this difference between the marginal revenue and marginal cost, okay? So marginal revenue is pretty simple, right? Every time you produce one additional unit, your total revenue increases by 5, okay? Marginal cost, you're talking about every time you produce one more unit, what happens to your total cost, right? Apparently, initially the total cost decreases, right? But after, the marginal cost decreases, right? But after a certain point, marginal cost increases, right? So let's say at this point, it was $2, right? So if you produce, say, Q1 unit of output, right? When you just produce that, let's say it was 50 units of output, right? That 50th unit of your total output added $3 to your total profit, right? Because you received $5 by selling that 50th unit, but it cost you $2 to produce that 50th unit, right? So that $3 is the marginal profit, okay? So if you think about the profit curve, right? You can say as long as your marginal revenue exceeds the marginal cost, right? Every time you produce more and more unit, right? Your profit increases, Okay? But when you go beyond this level, then the marginal cost exceeds the marginal revenue, okay? Which means you're losing, right? For each additional unit you sell here, you receive only $5, but it costs $6, $7, $8 to produce those additional units, right? So your total profit actually goes down. Instead of adding to your total profit, you are losing, you are subtracting this difference, right, from your total profit, right? Total profit means how much you have accumulated, right, in your profit, right? So apparently, we come with the idea here, right? That is the profit maximizing quantity, right? Profit maximizing quantity is achieved when the marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Okay? So because we know this, so marginal revenue is actually the slope of the total revenue curve. Marginal cost is also the slope of the total cost curve, right? Another thing we can find out here is when the profit is maximized, right? This curve and this line, this curve and this line are what? Parallel, right? That's a little bit advanced level, right? So in the principles of economics, we can explain it this way, right? In intermediate micro, right? We use equation, and we find out that, well, there's another way to prove it because we have this equation, right? So if you take, okay, we know that when the profit is maximized, the slope is 0, right? So when does it become 0, right? That's when the marginal revenue equals marginal cost according to that equation, right? So what that means is when the profit is maximized, these two curves or whatever, curve and line are parallel. Okay? So that's the idea. Going back to this graph here, right? We're talking about marginal cost of fund, right? What is the cost for each additional amount of fund versus what's the return, right? Something like revenue, okay? So we're talking about the marginal revenue crossing marginal cost, okay? So you can understand the same way, right? So if you just undertake project A only, right? Then what's the return on your money? Right? It says expected return is 24%, right? But the cost of capital is about 9%, right? So that difference will be added to your profit, right? And if you take another project, B, right? Then this difference between the expected return and the cost of capital will be also added to your profit, right? Which means your company is growing. I mean, your asset, right? Your equity will grow, right? As a kind of what I can think of, yeah. Anyway, you can just consider that's added to your profit, right? So rather than just stopping here, you have to go on, right? If you are really trying to maximize your profit, right? Then you have to undertake all the projects that exceed your cost of capital, okay? Because let's say, well, let's think about this project E, right? There's a very little difference between the expected return and the cost of capital. But still, $1 is a money, right? So if you're really trying to maximize your profit, you have to undertake all the projects, right, that promises a positive return, right, and increase your profit, right? That's the idea. Yeah. All right. All right. My assistant is about to come in, so let's do this. Do you have any question? Not yet? Okay. All right, so let me just think about this capital budgeting process. It's a kind of overview. Okay? So first thing is you have to consider the project proposal. In other words, what are we trying to achieve? Right? What's the goal of these projects? Is that growth of the company, or cost reduction to make the company more efficient, right? Or because of regulatory concerns, suddenly government says you have to do something, right? You have to reduce your carbon dioxide emission, right? So you have to install some equipments on your plant, right, to reduce or to protect the environment, right? Well, then that suddenly requires money, right, or capital investment. Okay? And then, so once you decide on the investment project proposal, then you have to estimate the cash flows. Okay, what's the expected cash flows throughout the life of this project? Okay? And then you have to evaluate alternatives, okay, whether there are alternatives or not. Okay. So once you select the project and actually implement the project, then the final step is reviewing the project's performance. Okay. What's that for? Why do you need the review? Or you can call it the post-project assessment, right? What's that for?
To see if you made the right decision.
Well, you have already spent money there, so what do you need?
Same mistake.
That's right, right? For the future projects, right? You need to find out whether this project was worth, right? Or whether you did everything right, okay? So, in the future, if you have similar situation, you shouldn't make any or similar mistake, right? Okay. Principles of estimating cash flows. I think we should, let me see. Why don't we go on until she comes, okay? All right. So the next process in this chapter is actually details on how to estimate the cash flows from any project, okay? There are a few points you have to remember. The cash flows should be measured on an incremental basis, okay? And what that means is you have to compare the possible cash flows with investment to without investment. Okay. So actually, let me skip a few slides here. This is slide number 11. Okay. So in order to come up with a net cash flow, what we're going to do is, first of all, we're going to think about the revenue, right? Revenue of your project without revenue of your company, right? With the project versus without the project, okay? Okay. So that's the difference. What difference does the project make in terms of revenue? The same thing for operational cost. we're going to subtract the cost from the revenue. You know why, right? Because that's the net cash flow, right? We're talking about the profit, right? All right, so everything should be done incremental basis, right? That's the idea of.
So
What does incremental basis mean? Well, that's what I just explained. Huh?
What is it?
Oh, what is incremental, right? Incremental means additional, right? So when you do something, what's the change or net change in the revenue, right? Because of this, the new project, right? So we have to, instead of considering the total revenue you have, right, for the company, you have to compare the with project versus without the project, right? So you know that the company may make a lot of money right now, right? Say your total revenue is $500 million per year, right? That doesn't matter. What matters is when you undertake a new project, Project A, right? What happens to your revenue, right? The change, increment in your revenue, right? So you have to compare with the project, without the project. Okay? That's the idea. Okay? You ready? Okay. All right, so we're going to stop here today.